Hello guys, today I'll be reading Reddit stories for 30 minutes. I hope you enjoy the stories, and if you do, please like and comment for more video like that. Okay, so the first story is, I'm 30M and my family thinks I'm holding a grudge for too long. When I turned 18, my grandfather left me his house. My parents convinced me I was too young to own property and insisted I sell it before it became a financial burden. They even found the realtor and helped with everything, telling me I was making the smart decision. A few years later, I discovered the buyer wasn't a stranger at all. It was my uncle, who transferred the house to my parents shortly after the sale. They had planned everything from the beginning because they wanted the property for themselves. While they rented it out and watched its value increase, I struggled to pay rent and student loans. Now they're retired, in serious debt, and asking to move into the house I spent years saving for. They say I should forgive them because they're family, but I can't forget how easily they manipulated me when I was 18. My siblings think I'm being selfish, while I think this is simply the consequence of their own choices. Alright, so the second one is, I worked for the same engineering company for 5 years and loved what I did. The only problem was my manager constantly presented my work as his own. Every successful project somehow became his achievement, while I was told to be patient because my hard work would eventually pay off. Instead of arguing, I quietly saved emails, project files, and meeting notes. I never planned to use them, but I couldn't ignore what was happening. Everything changed when our company was bought by a larger corporation. During an internal audit, someone found an old email chain proving my manager had been forwarding my work to executives under his own name. That single discovery led to a much larger investigation, and it turned out I wasn't the only employee he had taken credit from. Alright, so the third one is, for almost 2 years, my wife spent every Saturday helping her mother, who she said wasn't doing well. I never questioned it because I trusted her completely. One afternoon, her mother called to invite us over for dinner and casually mentioned she hadn't seen her daughter in nearly a year. I thought she was joking, but she wasn't. I immediately assumed my wife was having an affair, but the truth was more complicated. She had secretly taken a second job after making several bad financial decisions and was too embarrassed to tell me she'd lost most of our savings. One lie turned into dozens, and before long, she didn't know how to tell me the truth. What followed were months of difficult conversations, rebuilding trust, and deciding whether our marriage could survive. Ahaha, so this one was a crazy story. Let's begin with the fourth one. After my parents passed away, my siblings wanted to sell our childhood home, but I decided to buy it instead. While renovating the attic, I found a hidden compartment containing old journals, letters, and family photographs I'd never seen before. As I read through everything, I realized my parents had hidden an important part of our family's history for decades. The more I learned, the more I understood why certain relatives disappeared from our lives and why we suddenly moved when I was a child. It completely changed the way I remembered my parents and forced me to question everything I'd been told growing up. That was a good story too. So fifth is, when I was 24, my best friend called me in tears asking to borrow $10,000. He claimed it was for a family emergency and promised to pay me back within a year. A week later, he quit his job, changed his phone number, and disappeared without saying another word. Everyone told me I'd been scammed, and eventually I accepted that I'd never see him again. 15 years later, I unexpectedly ran into him while on a business trip. Instead of avoiding me, he asked if we could talk. What he told me completely changed how I remembered that day. The money hadn't been spent the way I'd assumed, and the reason he disappeared had nothing to do with greed. It became a conversation about guilt, forgiveness, and whether some friendships can survive even the biggest betrayals. Okay, so sixth story is, ever since I moved into my house, my elderly neighbor found something to complain about. My lawn was too long, my car was parked wrong, my music was too loud, even when it wasn't. I assumed she simply didn't like me, so I kept my distance. Everything changed when she collapsed while gardening, and I was the only person nearby to help. After that, she slowly opened up and admitted the real reason she'd avoided me for years. I looked almost identical to her son, who had died in a car accident over 20 years ago. Every time she saw me, it brought back memories she'd spent decades trying to bury. What started as neighborhood drama slowly turned into an unexpected
friendship that changed both of our lives. I'd say very good story. So, seventh story is, growing up, my younger sister somehow managed to make every important moment about herself. Birthdays, graduations, holidays, Even my engagement all ended with some kind of argument that my parents always blamed on stress or emotions. They constantly asked me to be the bigger person because that's just how she is. I accepted it until my aunt pulled me aside during a family gathering and revealed something she'd kept secret for over 20 years. Suddenly, every strange family interaction started making sense. It didn't excuse my sister's behavior, but it explained why my parents had treated us so differently our entire lives. Deciding what to do with that information ended up changing my relationship with my entire family. Alright, ETH story is, for months I noticed small things that didn't make sense. A chair would be slightly out of place. Lights I'd turned off were suddenly on, and food in my refrigerator seemed to move around. Nothing valuable was ever missing, so I convinced myself I was imagining things. Eventually, I installed a security camera and discovered my landlord entering my apartment while I was at work. I was furious until he explained what had really been happening. An elderly tenant upstairs with memory problems had accidentally caused several plumbing leaks, and my landlord had been checking apartments below to prevent serious damage whenever emergencies happened. While he technically had the legal right to enter during emergencies, it opened up a much bigger conversation about privacy, responsibility, and helping a neighbor who could no longer live alone. Okay, next one is, my grandfather lived a very simple life. He drove the same truck for 30 years, wore old clothes, and never spent money unless he absolutely had to. After he passed away, everyone assumed there wouldn't be much left besides the house. While cleaning out his garage, we found boxes filled with receipts, letters, and notebooks that told a completely different story. For decades, he'd quietly paid medical bills for strangers, funded scholarships for local students, and helped families who had lost everything after house fires. He never told anyone, not even his own children. As we tracked down the people he'd helped, we realized my grandfather had changed hundreds of lives without ever asking for recognition. That was a good story too. So 10th story is, my grandfather lived a very simple life. He drove the same truck for 30 years, wore old clothes, and never spent money unless he absolutely had to. After he passed away, everyone assumed there wouldn't be much left besides the house. While cleaning out his garage, we found boxes filled with receipts, letters, and notebooks that told a completely different story. For decades, he'd quietly paid medical bills for strangers, funded scholarships for local students, and helped families who had lost everything after house fires. He never told anyone, not even his own children. As we tracked down the people he'd helped, we realized my grandfather had changed hundreds of lives without ever asking for recognition. So next one is, my roommate never paid rent on time. When he finally moved out, he left behind a locked safe. I lived with the same roommate for almost 4 years. He was a nice guy, but he was always late paying rent and constantly claimed he was struggling financially. I covered his share more times than I can count because I didn't want us to get evicted. One day, he packed up and moved across the country with almost no notice. While cleaning his old room, I found a heavy safe hidden in the back of the closet with my address written on it. I debated whether I should open it or try to contact him first, but curiosity eventually won. What I found inside completely changed the way I looked at our friendship and explained why he'd been acting so strangely during the last few months we lived together. Alright, next one is, my girlfriend always said she hated surprises. Then I found out she'd been planning one for 2 years. My girlfriend and I had been together for almost 6 years, and she always told me she hated surprises. Every birthday and holiday was carefully planned because unexpected things made her anxious. A few months before our anniversary, I accidentally found a folder on our shared computer filled with receipts, emails, and notes that stretched back nearly 2 years. At first, I thought she was hiding something from me, but the more I looked, the more confused I became. She'd been secretly planning something that involved dozens of our friends, my family, and even my old college roommates. The problem was that I wasn't supposed to find out, and now I had to pretend I knew nothing while wondering whether I should tell her I'd accidentally discovered everything.
Alright, next one is, my dad kept telling me to never sell his old pickup truck. After he passed away, I finally understood why. My dad owned the same rusty pickup truck for over 30 years. Everyone in the family joked that it was falling apart and constantly encouraged him to replace it, but he refused every single time. Before he passed away, the only thing he specifically asked me was to never sell the truck, no matter how much someone offered. I thought it was just sentimental value until I started cleaning it out. Hidden under the seat and inside old toolboxes were letters, photographs, and journals that told the story of nearly every important moment in his life. That old truck had quietly become a time capsule, and by the time I finished reading everything, I understood why it meant more to him than any amount of money. Wow, that was a crazy story, ha ha. So next one is, I thought my coworker was trying to get me fired until I learned what was really going on. A new employee joined our office, and almost immediately things started going wrong for me. Meetings were scheduled without me, important emails somehow never reached my inbox, and mistakes I didn't make were suddenly being blamed on me. I became convinced my coworker was trying to push me out so he could take my position. I started documenting everything just in case I needed to defend myself. A few months later, HR called both of us into a meeting, and I finally learned the truth. Neither of us had been sabotaging the other. Someone else in the department had been manipulating both of us to cover up their own mistakes, and we'd spent months blaming each other instead of noticing who was actually responsible. Alright, so next story is, I ignored my grandmother's birthday letter for 5 years. Opening it changed my entire family. My grandmother gave me a sealed envelope on my 21st birthday and told me not to open it until I truly felt lost in life. I thanked her, put it in a drawer, and honestly forgot about it. 5 years later, after losing my job and ending a long-term relationship, I found the envelope while packing to move. Inside wasn't just a letter. There were family photographs, handwritten stories about relatives I'd never met, and an explanation of a decades-old disagreement that had divided our family long before I was born. What started as one letter turned into months of reconnecting with relatives, uncovering forgotten memories, and realizing my grandmother had spent years trying to repair relationships she knew she wouldn't live long enough to fix herself. Good story. Also, haha, so next is a bit interesting. My wife started leaving the house every Thursday night. I thought she was cheating until I followed her. My wife and I have been married for 9 years, and we've always had a strong relationship. About a year ago, she started leaving the house every Thursday evening, saying she needed some time to herself. At first, I didn't think much of it because everyone deserves personal space. But after months of the same routine, I started noticing little things that didn't add up. She'd come home emotionally drained, sometimes with red eyes like she'd been crying, but whenever I asked if everything was okay, she'd smile and tell me she was just tired from work. I eventually let my imagination get the better of me. I convinced myself she was seeing someone else, even though I'd never had a reason not to trust her before. One Thursday, I decided to follow her, fully expecting to catch her meeting another man. Instead, she parked outside a community center and walked into a support group. After speaking with one of the organizers, I learned she'd been secretly attending meetings for adults who had lost siblings. Her younger brother had died years before we met, and she'd never properly dealt with the grief. She admitted she hid it from me because she didn't want me to think she was still living in the past. That night turned into one of the hardest conversations we've ever had, and it completely changed how we communicated with each other. All right. So next one is, my neighbor asked me to feed his dog for one weekend. 3 months later, he still hadn't come home. A retired man named Frank lived next door to me for almost 5 years. We weren't close friends, but we'd chat over the fence, shovel each other's driveways in the winter, and occasionally watch each other's houses while one of us was away. One Friday afternoon, he knocked on my door and asked if I could feed his dog while he visited his daughter for the weekend. It wasn't a big deal, so I agreed. The weekend came and went, but Frank never returned. His phone went straight to voicemail, and his daughter insisted he had never planned to visit her. The police eventually became involved, but there was no sign of him. While taking care of his dog, I slowly discovered unpaid bills, unopened letters, and a collection of notebooks that suggested Frank had been trying to track down someone from his past for years. The story follows the months that followed, the friendships formed with his family, and the surprising explanation for where he'd been all that time. So next story is, my dad always told me I was adopted. The DNA test revealed a completely different family secret. Growing up, my dad always joked that I must have been adopted because I looked nothing like anyone else in the family. Everyone laughed, including me, because it was obviously just a running joke. Last Christmas, my cousins bought everyone DNA test kits for fun, and I figured it would be interesting to see where my ancestors came from. When the results came back, nothing made sense. I matched every member of my family exactly as expected, except for one person, my father. According to the results, we weren't biologically related at all. At first, I assumed there had been some kind of laboratory mistake, but after several more tests and a long conversation with my parents, I discovered a family secret that had been hidden for over 30 years. Nobody had lied out of malice, but one decision made before I was born had shaped my entire life without me ever knowing. The weeks that followed were filled with difficult conversations, unexpected relatives, and learning that family isn't always defined by biology. Very good story, I'd say, haha. So next one is, I bought an old camera at a yard sale. The photos inside led me to someone who had been looking for them for decades. I enjoy collecting vintage cameras, so when I found an old film camera at a neighborhood yard sale for $5, I bought it without thinking twice. It still had a roll of undeveloped film inside, and out of curiosity, I decided to have it developed. Most of the pictures were ordinary family moments from what looked like the late 1990s, but there was something strangely personal about them. Whoever owned the camera had clearly documented an important period of their life before it somehow ended up forgotten in a box. I became curious enough to start searching for the people in the photos. What began as a simple hobby quickly turned into months of tracking down old addresses, contacting former neighbors, and piecing together the story of a family that had lost touch after a series of unexpected events. Eventually, I found the woman who had taken the photographs. She'd spent over 20 years believing those memories were gone forever, and returning them led to a reunion neither of us expected. All right, so next one is, my grandfather told me to open one drawer in his workshop after he passed away. I wish I'd asked him why. My grandfather taught me everything I know about woodworking. Every Saturday, we'd spend hours together in his workshop, building furniture, repairing old tools, or simply talking about life. Before he passed away, he gave me one very specific instruction. When I'm gone, don't sell the workshop until you've opened the bottom drawer of my workbench. A few weeks after the funeral, I finally worked up the courage to go back. The drawer wasn't locked, but it was packed so tightly with journals, letters, receipts, and carefully labeled envelopes that it looked like he'd been preparing it for years. As I read through everything, I realized he'd documented nearly every important decision he'd ever made, including several he regretted deeply. There were letters addressed to family members who had stopped speaking to each other decades earlier, unfinished projects he'd hoped someone would complete, and one final letter addressed to me, explaining why he'd trusted me with everything, instead of leaving it to his own children. What I expected to be a simple afternoon in the workshop became months of uncovering family history and slowly bringing relatives back together after years of silence. So next story is, my landlord offered to cut my rent in half. 5 months later, I found out why. When my lease was up for renewal, my landlord surprised me by offering to lower my rent instead of raising it. Everyone I knew thought I had gotten incredibly lucky because rents in my city had been increasing every year. He never asked for anything in return and simply said I was the kind of tenant every landlord hopes for. For months, everything seemed normal until I started noticing contractors inspecting the building almost every week. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation that made me realize my landlord had known the building was going to be sold long before anyone else did. What followed was months of uncertainty as tenants worried about being forced out, and I eventually learned the real reason he'd wanted to keep me around. The decision he made ended up affecting dozens of families, not just mine. All right, so next story is, my mom asked me to clean out the attic. I found a box she didn't know still existed. After my parents decided to downsize, my mom asked me to help clean out the attic. It was mostly old decorations and broken furniture until I found a dusty box tucked behind insulation with my mother's maiden name written across the top. She looked genuinely confused when I carried it downstairs and insisted she'd never seen it before. Inside were letters, photographs, newspaper clippings, and a small notebook dating back almost 40 years. None of it was dramatic, but together it told the story of a friendship my mother had lost contact with after high school. Curious, I started searching online to see if I could find the people mentioned in the letters. What began as a simple search turned into months of reconnecting families who hadn't spoken in decades and helping my mom rediscover a part of her life she'd almost forgotten. Next story is, my brother asked me to watch his house for a week. I accidentally discovered he'd been living a double life. My older brother travels a lot for work, so it wasn't unusual when he asked me to check on his house while he was away for a week. A few days in, packages started arriving almost every morning, all addressed to names I'd never heard before. At first I thought they had been delivered to the wrong address, but then someone knocked on the door asking for one of those people. Confused, I called my brother, but he wouldn't answer any of my questions. When he finally came home, he admitted there was something he'd been hiding from the entire family for years. It wasn't anything illegal or dangerous, but it completely changed the way I saw him. Keeping the secret had cost him friendships, relationships, and opportunities, and he finally decided it was time to tell everyone the truth. Very good story, I'd say. So next one is, I thought my grandpa was forgetting things. Then I realized he was leaving me clues. After my grandmother passed away, my grandpa started acting differently. He'd forget where he left things, ask the same questions repeatedly, and sometimes tell stories that didn't quite make sense. Everyone assumed he was developing memory problems, but something about it didn't feel right to me. One day, I noticed every item he claimed to lose was somehow connected to an old photograph or document hidden somewhere in the house. Slowly, I realized he wasn't forgetting anything at all. He was leading me through the story of his life, one clue at a time, because he knew he wouldn't be around much longer to tell it himself. By the time I reached the final clue, I'd learned more about my grandparents than I had in the previous 25 years. All right, the next story is, I took over my dad's small business after he retired. That's when I learned why everyone in town respected him. When my dad retired after nearly 40 years, I took over his small repair shop. I expected it to be difficult, but I figured most of the job would involve fixing equipment and managing employees. Instead, during my first few weeks, people kept stopping by just to thank my father for things I'd never heard about. An elderly couple brought homemade cookies because my dad had repaired their furnace for free during a harsh winter. A former employee told me my dad had secretly paid his rent after he lost his job. Local business owners shared stories of loans he'd given without expecting repayment and favors he'd done without telling anyone, including our own family. As I sorted through old invoices and handwritten notes, I realized my father had quietly helped hundreds of people over the years while pretending business was just doing okay. Taking over the shop became about more than continuing a family business. It became about living up to a reputation I never knew he had built. Okay, so next one is, my dad asked me to drive him to the same diner every Friday. After he passed away, I finally learned why. For almost 3 years, my dad insisted we have lunch together every Friday at the same small diner across town. I always thought it was just his favorite place to eat, even though the food wasn't anything special. We'd sit in the same booth, order the same meals, and talk about work, sports, or whatever was going on in our lives. A few weeks after he passed away, one of the waitresses recognized me and asked if I was going to continue what your father started. I had no idea what she meant. She explained that every Friday, after I left for work, my dad secretly paid for meals for people who couldn't afford them. He'd been doing it for over 10 years without telling anyone, and the staff only realized I didn't know after his funeral. Learning about that quiet tradition changed the way I remembered him and inspired me to continue it in his honor. Okay, so next story is, my cousin asked to stay with me for just 2 weeks. 6 months later, I found out why he never left. My cousin called me out of nowhere saying he'd lost his apartment after his landlord sold the building. I had a spare bedroom, so I agreed to let him stay for a couple of weeks while he found another place. He was respectful, paid for groceries, and constantly assured me he was applying for apartments. Weeks turned into months, and every time I asked how the search was going, he had another excuse. I started wondering if he was taking advantage of my kindness. Eventually, I discovered he had been hiding a serious problem that he was too embarrassed to tell anyone in the family about. Instead of simply asking for help, he'd convinced himself he had to solve everything alone. What followed was months of difficult conversations, rebuilding trust, and helping him get his life back on track. All right, so next one is, I found an old wallet in a thrift store jacket. Returning it turned into a year-long friendship. I bought a vintage jacket at a thrift store for $20 because it fit perfectly. When I got home, I reached into one of the inside pockets and found an old leather wallet that had somehow been missed before the jacket was donated. Inside were photographs, an expired driver's license, and several handwritten notes, but no money. I debated mailing it back anonymously, but curiosity got the better of me, and I tracked down the owner. He was in his 70s and couldn't believe the wallet had finally been found after almost 25 years. When I returned it, he invited me in for coffee and told me the story of how he'd lost it. One visit turned into many, and over the next year we became unlikely friends. I ended up learning more from him about life, family, and growing older than I ever expected from a simple trip to a thrift store. Okay, so next one is, my mom always told me to never open the locked cabinet in the basement. After she moved away, I finally did. Growing up, there was one cabinet in our basement that was always locked. Whenever I asked what was inside, my mom would smile and say it was full of boring paperwork. After my parents retired and moved closer to my sister, they gave me the house. While renovating the basement, I found the key taped underneath one of the shelves. Inside wasn't anything shocking or illegal. Instead, it contained dozens of carefully organized binders filled with letters, family recipes, photographs, and handwritten stories from relatives dating back almost a century. My mom had quietly spent years preserving our family's history because she was afraid it would disappear after the older generations passed away. Reading through everything gave me a completely different appreciation for my family's past and motivated me to keep adding to the collection for future generations. All right, so next one is, my high school teacher remembered me 15 years later. I had no idea why until he showed me an old notebook. While visiting my hometown, I ran into one of my old high school teachers at a local bookstore. I barely expected him to recognize me after so many years, but he greeted me by name and asked if I had a few minutes to talk. We ended up having coffee, where he pulled an old notebook out of his bag and showed me something I'd completely forgotten. Inside was an essay I'd written during my senior year about wanting to become successful enough to help my family. He told me he'd kept it because it reminded him why he became a teacher in the first place. He then admitted that during one of the hardest periods of my life, several teachers had quietly worked together to make sure I had school supplies, lunch money, and opportunities I never realized were being provided behind the scenes. What I thought had been simple acts of luck were actually the result of people who believed in me long before I believed in myself. 15 years later, finally hearing that story made me realize just how many people had helped shape my life without ever asking for recognition. Okay, so next one is, I kept finding fresh flowers on my grandmother's grave. Nobody in my family knew who was leaving them. My grandmother passed away 5 years ago, and every month I visit her grave. Recently, I noticed there were always fresh flowers there before I arrived. I asked everyone in my family if they had been visiting, but they all said no. One morning, I decided to get there early. An elderly man arrived carrying a small bouquet and introduced himself. He told me he and my grandmother had been close friends when they were young and reconnected years later. They stayed in touch until she passed away, but kept their friendship private. Before leaving, he handed me an old photo of them in high school and said he promised her he'd never stop bringing flowers. It reminded me that the people we love often have stories we'll never fully know.